So this part two is what we wanted to do was really unpack Bill's letter on emotional sobriety, which was written in 1956. So just prior to Bill writing this letter, there was a gentleman in California who was depressed. And yes, people in California get depressed, even with our great weather. And he wrote back to the General Service Office and says, look, I've been struggling with my depression. I'm wondering if anybody can give me some ideas on how the steps might be able to help with my depression. And as most of you probably know, Bill struggled with his depression throughout his whole life. He had a chronic depression. And I'm imagining this, it might be true, that Bill saw that letter and said, I'd really, really like to respond to that, because he had been doing a lot of work on trying to figure out what he could do to deal with his depression, how he could find some kind of freedom. So what we're going to hear is pretty much a synthesis of the ideas, the concepts that Bill had been struggling with, digesting, processing over the past 21 years in his recovery. So the format that we're going to use for this is I'm going to play a little segment. A lot of people ask, is this Bill Wilson's voice you're going to be hearing? And no, it's not. It's Nick Luckenbill's voice. And Nick is a Broadway actor, and he's married to Lucille Ball. So that's who you're going to be hearing. So I will play a little segment of Bill's letter, and then I will say a few comments, and then the other panelists will be invited to react and comment as well. Here we go.
I think many oldsters who have put our booze cure to severe but successful tests still find that they often lack emotional sobriety. Perhaps they will be the spearhead for the next major development in AA, the development of much more real maturity and balance, which is to say, humility in our relations with ourselves, with our fellows, and with God.
So this is the second time I've seen the phrase emotional sobriety used in Bill's writing. The first was obviously with what I shared earlier in the 12 and 12. So here he talks about it, but here he defines, he goes into much more detail of what emotional sobriety is. So he talks about real maturity and balance. So let me just start by commenting on what do we mean by real maturity? Well, I like to think of maturity as the transcendence of environmental support to self-support. So let's take a minute and digest that. I'm using digest a lot. I must be really hungry right now. It's very interesting. So when we transcend environmental support, we're all born, we have the longest period of infant dependency of any other species on this planet. And so we need, we're very dependent when we're first born to, for our caregivers to be able to feed us, to respond to our needs. But quickly within the infant, a desire that moves that child towards autonomy, towards realizing its potential starts to show up. And, some of the first evidence is that an infant is not as helpless as we think. We've, a lot of developmental psychologists have just talked about how adept infants are at controlling their parents. I mean, it's an amazing experience. But also quickly that, starts to happen when they start to reach the age of a year old. They start to develop the ability to want to walk. And it's turning from the belly to the back and the back to the belly, and then it's getting up on all fours and rocking. And every step of the way, what the child is doing is starting to develop the ability to, coordinate all of this muscular activity, and the child is actually chaining behavior patterns and neuropsychological pathways are being, developed so that child can now go from crawling to walking. No one No one has to tell a child to do that if the child is neurologically okay. The child will start to walk on its own. So that's the maturity in us. We want to grow towards our ability to take care of ourselves, to be autonomous, but things get in the way, right? The child does not have any expectations about, who or what he or she is supposed to be. They are just pure being. They cry when they need to cry. They laugh when they need to laugh. They have complete spontaneity. Well, we lose that. And so things start to change in our life. And so as we grow, we get in the way of our maturity with all of the ideas, these self-limiting beliefs, who we should be, how we should be, what we have to do to be loved and accepted. And all of this stuff interferes with us growing ourselves to be what we can be. So when Bill talks about real maturity, I think really he's talking about the restoration of our development. That's what we're looking at in recovery. Now, this balance, and I like when he talks about it, which is to say humility in our relations with ourselves, with our fellows, and with God. Well, humility becomes an important thing because I think it taps into what I was talking about earlier about who am I to put all of these demands on life, that life should conform to my expectations, that you should conform to my expectations. And I do that because once again, I'm caught in this idea, if things aren't the way they're supposed to be, I don't think I can be okay. And that's the environmental support that I need, that I think I need. That's really a mistaken belief. I need my environment. I need life to be a certain way to be okay. Self-support means I need to support myself to deal with whatever is happening in my life to be okay. And he's talking about we need to have a different relationship with ourselves. You're right. I mean, the expectations we have, the curse of perfectionism, which I'm sure we'll get into as we talk about this, all of these different things interfere with my ability to grow. But whatever I do to myself, I'm going to do to you. That's really the golden rule, is what I do to myself, I do to you. And so if I have a lot of shoulds about how I'm supposed to behave, well, you can rest assured that I'm going to put those shoulds on you. And you're going to have all of my, I like to call them unenforceable rules, which is not a great description because I do everything in the world to try to enforce them. But I have all these unenforceable rules on how you're supposed to behave, what you're supposed to do, so that I feel okay. And I do that same thing with life. So I do that. I put that on myself. I do that, to my fellows. And I also do that with my relationship with whatever higher power I have. So let me just open this up to the other panelists and see what they'd like to say about it. And I'll take a bite of my salad. John, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. And thank you. The thing that occurred to me about this whole thing is humility gets a really bad rap, I think, a lot of times. And I personally think of humility as just having an accurate self-appraisal and a recognition that I'm not the center of the universe. I'm just a little piece of it. And I get, but it's okay that I'm a piece of it. I count.
Yeah.
When I first got sober, I came out of a religious tradition that said that humility meant that I was a piece of shit that didn't deserve to live. And I don't see it that way anymore.
Let me just respond to that real quick, Joe. See, I think you're right on. See, when we have these ideas that can move us towards getting right size, they're double-edged swords, aren't they? So if I say I'm not that important, well, the part of me, the top dog in me, can use that to beat me up. Look, who the hell do you think you are? You're not that important. Nobody really cares about you. But the healthy side of me is going to take that and right size me to mean that, hey, I'm just a part of this experience, right? That it's not about what my expectations, but it's a learning to try to be coordinated. and to be able to enter into relationships, not lose myself, and at the same time be aware of the other person. So I think what you just said is so important, John. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was actually giving the floor to Marya, but I remember she said she didn't want to go first anymore. I would say this does show a certain maturing. I'm not putting words in a dead man's mouth, but I think if it was his choice, Bill Wilson would have rewrote the big book. Because you can see he's getting away from this sort of reductionist approach to, self-improvement and more about balance. And in terms of getting right with self and fellows and God. So he's a believer and I'm a skeptic. Of course, I'm the one who told you that if you want to learn about reality, here's a story about two stuffed animals talking to each other. So what do I know?
That's awesome. But see, the thing about that is that brings us to like the question of metaphor and higher power and humility. Those are all really intersecting things for me, because it doesn't actually matter to me what model you're using to think about how do we love and how do we live. It doesn't matter if it's the Velveteen Rabbit or if you're, whatever religious tradition you come from. The metaphors we understand and navigate the world with are the only way we get to understand the world. That brings us to like Hegel, we understand the world the only way we can. Humility to me is understanding that my apprehension of the world is always going to be limited. It doesn't mean I'm not important. It doesn't mean I am. It means that to the best of my ability, within the tools in the world I'm living in, I have a certain amount of responsibility to be within some sort of social framework. And to me, that brings up the question somebody just raised. Let me look at who it is. I'm sorry, Megan, I'm going to answer this not on Joe's behalf, but in answer to it because it interests me. The thoughts on community in the development of emotional sobriety and humility. None of us is an island unto ourselves, much as one would like to believe. I live in community no matter what I do. I'm always in the world with other human beings. They have rights, I have rights, and recognizing that I am neither more nor less than those other people, that's right-sizedness to me. It doesn't matter what religious or spiritual or theistic or non-theistic tradition I come from. I'm here, the guy next door is here, the woman over here is there. It doesn't actually matter who thinks they're more important. The fact is, we are all trying to share a very small spinning rock, and we're not doing all that well with it. And so I feel like the 12 steps, emotional sobriety, whatever framework you want to look at it through, I take up too much space a lot of the time, and I don't take up enough space a lot of the rest of the time. And so I think that, to me, right-sizedness is that constant calibration of who am I in context. It's never who am I cosmically. Well, who am I cosmically? I'm a little itty bitty speck. In context, I have influence on other people influence me. I don't get to take more than my fair share of space. I also don't get to take less. So.
Mm-hmm. What she said.
Again with that, I do want to continue on one point though. My friend Ruth used to criticize me in this wonderful way. I'd get on one of my jags about I've screwed this up, I messed this up, this was bad, this was wrong, and she'd like nod and give me the happy friend look, and she'd be like, so now today we're doing the special evil one routine, and I'd be like, shut up, Ruth, because it was such a good point. It just punctured my inverse pride so effectively, and it cracked me up because like I'm not any specialer as a bad person than I am as a great person. I can get into my grandiosity about how much I've screwed up almost instantaneously. So that's worth noting.
Love it. I love it. I love it.
That reminds me of something though. One of the symptoms of spiritual bypass was this thing of knowing everything, but there's the other side of that is I don't know anything. And it's the same kind of sense, I'm either the greatest or I'm the worst and all of that, and that is definitely not balance. I used to say balance is the point I cross on the way to the next extreme, but that's mellowed some in me.
And you know, the balance thing too is remember that one line I had about that emotional sobriety is an appropriate balance and coordination of all that we are. Well, that's part of it too, is to get all these different parts of ourselves working towards our, you know, becoming joint contributors to our wholeness, which, you know, is quite a challenge. And it's, as we've all said, that's a lifetime, you know, it takes a lifetime to do that. All right, well, let's move on to the next slide. Let's see what Bill says next.
Those adolescent urges that so many of us have for top approval, perfect security, and perfect romance, urges quite appropriate to age 17, prove to be an impossible way of life when we are at age 47 or 57.
Right. This is that idea that everybody has to like me for me to be okay. That's the top approval. Everyone's going to like me. Perfect security, that I'm never going to feel anxious. I'm never going to feel insecure. I'm never going to feel inadequate. I'm never going to be depressed. Perfect romance, you know, can be defined as my partner is always going to do what I want them to do to make me happy. Well, these do prove to be an impossible way of life. I think they're also impossible way of life at 17 years old, just like they are later on in life. But for some reason, this whole idea that it's about me gets so perpetuated in our culture. Christopher Lasch wrote an incredibly important book. He was I think a sociologist at Harvard, and he wrote the book called The Culture of Narcissism. And his whole point is that we are so self-centered in this culture, and we breed this kind of it's all about me kind of a thing. And we see it here. It's like everything's got to be a certain way. And that's the other thing that we breed in this culture is this idea of perfection. And boy, you know, I think that I have to be perfect. You have to be perfect. Life has to be perfect for everything to be okay. And I try to make that happen. So now I'll just let my panelists have some fun with this.
You know, I honestly think Bill was a constant seeker. And he would have gone, if he was a contemporary of ours, to adult children of alcoholics. He would have learned about the sort of Claudia Black stuff and the, that Alice Miller stuff that sort of told my secrets, the drama of the gifted child, and thou shalt not be aware about, you know, don't tell, don't feel, don't trust, that the sort of perfectionism that comes with that sort of, like he never told in his own AA story doesn't mention that he was twice abandoned by each parent, you know, and like his understanding of sort of trauma and sort of family dynamics and other people's impact on us was as underdeveloped as mine would be if I was a contemporary of his. It's easy to look back in our 2020 lens, but you can see that coming through in some of the things he's struggling with, or things that I struggled with, but luckily there were books and fellowships and places to go for some of that.
I want to speak to a couple of the comments that have just come up about from Paul and Tom both. The perfectibility, the myth of perfectibility is so interesting to me. I mean, you know, I've spent so freaking long in mental health care being told that my desire to be perfect is crazy and pathological. I'm like, at a certain point, yes, certainly. I took it a bit far. We all know that. However, the idea that things are perfect, can be perfect, are perfectible, whether it's human beings or other people's behavior toward me as a human being, or my life, or other people's lives, you know, the very simplistic, you know, program slogans are useful in this. The idea of comparing my insides to other people's outsides can be really fundamentally useful there. But further in, I start to think about, you know, the idea that there's comparing it all, that there's a standard of how people should be, should think, should live. And that brings me always to the question of like, what is the need for happiness? This pursuit of happiness is so interesting to me, because like happiness is a condition that's part of a larger broad morass of human experience. Whether life is good or not, it's not an either or. I can be greatly happy while terrible things are happening in my life, but that's a product of emotional recovery. I think earlier in my life, probably earlier in my recovery, the idea that things were messy in my life, that meant I was not happy. That meant I was not doing something right, or that meant someone else was messing with my setup, which of course is the other definition of being alive in a world with other people. And so someone is always messing with my setup. My life is always messy. Human beings are super, like there's that wonderful line, Philip Lope calls it the catastrophe of personality. I mean, none of us is ever going to be super simple. And if we've gotten to a simple state, we're not paying a lot of attention. I am at a point now, I'm not where I want to be yet because I'm perfecting myself right now. That's a process. I'm at a point now where I'm able to accept a degree of messiness in myself and be like, do I want to spend more time thinking about my messiness, which is to say thinking about myself and how I'm not perfect yet? Which is a little solipsistic, I have to say. At a certain point, I need to get out of my house is messy, the kitchen's a disaster, my relationships are complicated, my hair's going gray. Who freaking cares? I mean, there's other stuff to be done right now. There's just other stuff to be done. And it becomes a matter, to me, of prioritization. Am I perfect? No. We're done with that conversation. Is life perfect? No. Doesn't need to be talked about anymore. What needs to be talked about is like, where are changes that need to be made and how do I get to contribute to making them?
Great. I like that. What are your thoughts, John?
Well, I tell you, what I've been sitting here thinking about is there seems to be a particular point of view that Bill takes about life that is a very, what I would call a masculine view. And so I'm always kind of interested in, for instance, when we do the fourth step, it's all about the resentments we have toward these people and those people and that people. And my experience of a lot of women is that they have a very different, or they need a very different approach than that kind of externalized, egomaniacal, I am the captain of the world, approach. This idea that top approval, perfect security, and perfect romance. And I wonder how applicable that is. To tell you the truth, there's a feminine part of me that doesn't respond well to that. Let me put it that way. I call it feminine. It may not be, but probably if I had been born 30 years later, I might be one of those people out there talking about fluidity, but that's a different topic.
I think it's pertinent though, the question of, binaries, whether there's feminine thought or masculine thought, the experience of being in the world is not as cut and dried down. There are captain of the world and there are nurturers. I've had a variety of husbands, and some of them have been like, the problem with you is you're not nurturing enough. And I'm like, right, now I'm brokenhearted. And then the next dude's like, the problem with you is you take care of me all the damn time. And I'm like, well, you're not taking care of your damn self. And so there's a question of expediency also, not so much femininity, masculinity, nurturing, challenging, conquering, hunter-gatherer. I mean, okay, that's all fine. It's not exactly, it's not really that functional to be worrying in myself about like, am I nurturing enough? Am I conquering enough? Am I doing any of these things right enough? To me, the question there, and to go on what you're saying, John, and I think that's so pertinent, it doesn't really feed anyone emotionally or spiritually or in any kind of transformative way to think about, how do I categorize myself? Whether that's who I sleep with, who I talk to, how I identify myself. The idea of, what do we get to be in the world? How do I get to operate, whether it's fluid or fixed? The idea of anything fixed about human personality is just garbage. And so that, I think it's important for me to at least recognize that aspects of myself emerge and recede at different times and based on different circumstances. My goal at this point right now today is to develop the ones that are skillful and useful, and to kind of put to rest the ones that are really destructive, because those exist just as actively today as they ever did.
Yeah, see, the way I react to this, John, is I just see him using these terms. The way I see it is just this idea that I need to be someone other than who I am to be okay. That my being okay depends on forces outside of myself. And see, that's where I see him beginning to introduce us to this idea of this emotional dependency, or what I talked about before is our environmental support, right? That if I have these things, then I'm going to be okay. And because we're going to talk about at some point in here, and we can start now, this idea of an emotional center of gravity. If my emotional center of gravity is over my 2 feet or over my true self, however you want to think about it, then I am balanced, right? You know, we talk about, like, I remember when I was training with some Korean Marines in Vietnam, they taught us the horse stance, which was, I can't remember the Korean word for it, but it was translated to mean the immovable stance, because your feet are a little bit wider than shoulder width apart. You bend your knees. I used to be able to do that at one point. I actually could bend my knees. And then I drop down, and your weight is equally balanced over both feet. Your center of gravity is right in your center mass. And right, so that's where gravity is passing through you and connecting you to the earth. And so that's going right through me, connecting me to the earth, and I'm solid. I'm in a very solid fighting stance. Well, that's what we're talking about. That's me keeping my center of gravity over my feet. As soon as I look to you for me to be okay, I've taken my emotional center of gravity and I've now put it in you. So now how you are, how you treat me, how you feel, what's going on with you then determines my experience. I'm no longer the determining factor in what's going on. It's you. And because it's you, I'm invested in controlling you. You need to be this way. You need to be that way. You've got to live up to my expectations for me to be okay. And I can do that in terms of how I'm supposed to be, how you're supposed to be. If I put my center of gravity in a concept of who I'm supposed to be, or in perfectionism, I'm doing the same thing, right? I'm losing myself to that concept. I thought what you said, John, when you talked about that your whole philosophy is that you had to eradicate yourself to be okay. I thought that was such a powerful statement, because that's what all those solutions are, right? If I have to become a self other than I am, I'm rejecting who I am, thinking that if I become someone I'm not, then I'm going to be okay. And what a crazy life that creates. May I move on, panelists? I guess that's a yes.
Please do.
Pleased to do so.
Since AA began, I've taken immense wallops in all those areas because of my failure to grow up emotionally and spiritually. My God, how painful it is to keep demanding the impossible, and how very painful to discover finally that all along we had the cart before the horse. Then comes the final agony of seeing how awfully wrong we have been, but still finding ourselves unable to get off the emotional merry-go-round.
Well, Bill's criticized for a lot of things, but I really agree with what you said, Joe, a while ago. He really was a seeker, and he had an ability to be honest with himself about some of these things. And, you know, his talking about, now this is 21 years into the program, the co-founder of this program that's saving the lives of thousands and millions of people at that point in time. He talks about his failure to grow up emotionally and spiritually. You know, I love that. He talked about demanding the impossible, and that he had the cart before the horse. Well, what is the impossible? Well, the impossible is if life has to be a certain way for me to be okay, and people have to be a certain way for me to be okay, things have to be a certain way for me to be okay, then I am demanding the impossible. I'm demanding that life conform to my expectations. That's putting the cart before the horse, because I'm saying that life has to be a certain way for me to be okay. Instead of figuring out what I have to do, how I have to grow myself to better deal with what is in my life. We start to get an awareness of that, but then he says these are habits and patterns, and they're difficult things to break. How do we get off this emotional merry-go-round that we've created? Well, he's got some great ideas about that, and we'll be getting into those as we continue on.
You're not getting to share up on the screen. Your things aren't sharing to the screen.
The emotional sobriety. Oh,
Right.
hold on. Oh, that's what happened. Did I lose my share screen ability? Oh, it did.
Shouldn't have.
Okay, well, it did for some reason. So should I go back and do that one over?
I don't think so. I think you can probably continue, but I just wanted you to know that it wasn't sharing to the screen.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. So why don't you, can you guys see it now on the screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, well, what do you guys think? What do you want to say about this part?
I'd like to speak to the unable to get off the emotional merry-go-round. That actually is super, that's something I've been thinking about, and it hooks back to what I was thinking about as I was preparing my notes on the cycle of crisis and craving and crash. That to me is really the expectation there for me. What I was talking about there is the demand that life will be exciting and interesting all the time. And when I define life and interest as excitement, and a constant feeling of emotional intensity. To me, this is like, I'm pretty sure I'm not the only addict or person with compulsive behaviors who experiences a desire for constant interest, intensity, and entertainment. However, that has never served me well. It has gotten me in more garbage trucks of my own life than I care to experience again out loud. That said, I do find myself pulled toward it. And so that demand for life to be engaging, I'm aware that comes in part from having grown up in an era and in a culture that is constant infotainment. I'm also aware that it's partly influenced by the field in which I live. Professionally, I'm in news. I'm like, news is flying at my face all the time. And that, I get a rush out of that, don't I now? Because I just don't turn it off. But I'm starting to, because I am having to learn at this late date, that excitement is exhausting. Not only is it physiologically exhausting from what we know about cortisol and everything like that, that demand that everything be exciting and intense all the time is in itself a self-perpetuating addictive rut that I get into. And so the immaturity of that, yes, is real. But I'm also aware all the time that I'm being fed. That aspect, that vulnerability in me is constantly being fed. You want more excitement, Marya? You want more entertainment, Marya? You can have it, you can have it, you can have it. Doesn't come in a bottle anymore, but boy, can I find it other places. So
That merry-go-round thing, like the merry-go-round doesn't stop. That's, like I'm wanting the world to, accommodate me, right? That aversion and attachment thing I was talking about, what I'm trying to get away from, what I need more of. It just doesn't work that way. I have to get used to the spinning a little bit. Johan Hari, just to speak to something someone else asked about community, talked about how the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. Yes, but there's a little bit of reductionism going on there because the crack house has a community waiting for me, and they'll welcome me back with open arms, right? So it's a matter of what kind of influences, what kind of community, what's the quality of my sort of recovery capital network. I think that's important. Who's going to be on that merry-go-round with me is really the best I can do, because it ain't going to stop spinning.
Great point. Great point. So it's not just the community, it's the kind of community, isn't the kind of connections in that community. I like that a lot.
There's an element to which departing from popular wisdom, which is that I need to be on my phone all the time. I need to be on the internet all the time. I was giving a talk really recently at a college where people were like, how do you dial down your engagement with popular culture? I'm like, turn off your phone. The look they gave me was like, kill your puppy. I mean, I was like, they looked as if I suggested they do something horrible. I'm like, no, the phone that you're like attached to your face, turn it off. And and they were offended. It's not that I diminish the fact that generationally people are raised with these phones, but in fact, if we want to know how to lower that cortisol, if we want to know how to disengage with that hyper attenuated, hyper vigilance engagement with popular culture and all of its icky, really we do need to really dial it down ourselves. It will not dial down itself. It's profiting off our engagement at a very, very literal level. If I don't step away, it'll keep feeding on my interest.
Mm-hmm.
I had a sponsor who said chasing the excitement is part of the problem.
Yes. All right, let's go to the next slide. I think we're going to replay this one really quick.
Since AA began, I've taken immense wallops in all those areas because of my failure to grow up emotionally and spiritually. My God, how painful it is to keep demanding the impossible, and how very painful to discover finally that all along we had the cart before the horse. Then comes the final agony of seeing how awfully wrong we have been, but still finding ourselves unable to get off the emotional merry-go-round. How to translate a right mental conviction into a right emotional result, and so into easy, happy, and good living. Well, that's not only the neurotic's problem, it's the problem of life itself for all of us who have got to the point of real willingness to hew to right principles in all of our affairs.
I think what Bill is relating to here is this idea that we can get these things intellectually, but integrating them into our life so they become available to us to use, to bring to our life, to bring into action, means that they have to be integrated. So they have to be integrated on an emotional, not just an intellectual level. We have to put our intellect and emotions together. Now, how do you do that? Well, it takes practice. It takes trying some of these things on and seeing what happens. You know, I think one of the important things to remember is that a lot of recovery is about experimentation, is taking an experimental attitude towards our life and saying, let me try this on for size and see what it's like for me, how it fits, what experience I have when I try this on, and especially those things that are uncomfortable for me, because that's part of what recovery is expanding that comfort zone I have so that I develop some new possibilities. And that's the way I really like to think about defining recovery, is the discovery of new possibilities. So, panelists, do you have thoughts about this slide?
In other words, that was so well put. Let's move on.
I think we can. Let's do it. It would help if I could see you guys, but I can't see anybody with this. I'm just seeing my slide. So it's like I'm doing one of those instrument flying things, right? Where there's no other feedback. So
Even then, as we hew away, peace and joy may still elude us. That's the place so many AA oldsters have come to. And it's a hell of a spot, literally. How shall our unconscious, from which so many of our fears, compulsions, and phony aspirations still stream, be brought into line with what we actually believe, know, and want? How to convince our dumb, raging, and hidden Mr. Hyde becomes our main task.
well, this is a very, very important slide for me, because it really shows us the work that Bill was doing. Somebody asked in one of the questions earlier, was Bill in psychotherapy? Was he seeing a therapist? Now, I know he was having a lot of dialogues and experience with a lot of spiritual leaders in our country at that time. He was also in contact and had a very intimate relationship with Dr. Harry Tiebout, he was a psychoanalytically trained psychiatrist living in Connecticut, and really was the first psychiatrist or person in the mental health field that befriended Alcoholics Anonymous, and was working with a lot of members, members that were in members of the fellowship that were in Connecticut, and really had some great observations. In fact, there's a collected works of Dr. Harry Tebow available at Hazleton, and I strongly encourage anyone to read that, because his insights, I think, are still very, very relevant. So Bill is talking about his unconscious, from which so many of his fears, compulsions, and phony aspirations still stream. So let's talk about, well, what is his fear? Well, I thought when John was sharing with us what he experienced when he was growing up was just a great example of that. Feeling like you don't belong. How can I belong in this world? I want to be loved. I want to be accepted. That is such an important desire for us. And the sense and the fear that we have that we're not going to be loved, we're not going to be accepted, we're not going to belong, generates what Dr. Karen Horney called this basic anxiety. And this basic anxiety starts us looking for that search for glory. You know, who do I have to become to be okay? So that's the phony aspiration, that I can become a certain way where I'm going to ensure that I'm going to be loved, I'm going to be accepted, that I'm going to belong, that I'm just going to feel okay all the time. Once we decide on that blueprint, that this is who I'm going to become, now we actualize a concept of who we should be instead of actualizing ourselves. That actualization of that concept becomes a compulsion. I must be this way no matter what. That's what a compulsive behavior is. The obsessive compulsive person must wash their hands 20 times. If I, decided that I have to master, that's the way that I'm going to be loved and accepted. I'm going to have what we call the appeal of mastery, that I'm just going to be the best at everything, then I've got to be the best. If my solution was the appeal of love, then I've just got to get someone to love me. If my appeal is the appeal of freedom, then I'm not going to have any needs or any wants, and I'm going to do that the best I can. I'm going to try to perfect that idea of who I have to be. So all the energy gets put into actualizing a concept of who we are instead of actualizing who we actually are. So he said, how can this really be brought into line with what we actually believe in, know, and want? I think, how can this really be brought into line with reality? Well, we have to convince our dumb and raging Mr. Hyde becomes our main task. So this gets us to the idea that we're not one self. There's a lot of different parts of us. And there's this one part that says, I have to be this way, I have to be that way to be okay. And now our task is to come to learn to deal with this side of ourselves, so that we can have a more harmonious relationship rather than to be at a civil war with ourselves all the time. Well, that was a mouthful.
It was a good one. That
That's
was
true.
really, I found that super, super helpful, because first I want to kind of note that in 1958, the idea of the unconscious was still super Freudian. And that the idea behind that obviously was that there are drives and there are innate drives, and that's super gender shit going on there. That said, those fears and compulsions and phony aspirations are also looking at how we are shaped now as cultural and social beings in part. Those phony aspirations, I think, are so papered over with, and they say I have to do this, and this person says I have to do this. We is a really broad term. I have started to think that the idea of oneself is very, very hard to narrow down at all. I mean, like Dr. Berger says, there are lots of selves within us. I had a therapist I talked to about my inner Tasmanian devil. She's like, do you just have an inner child like other people? I'm like, you also have this inner Tasmanian in any freaking way. And if you leave her alone and let her go hiking by her damn self, she's fine. Older, you have a problem. So there's inner pieces of ourselves that are not that well behaved. The idea that there is a singular self is so dominant still, but also so totally wrong-headed. one afternoon I'm talking like a professor, one afternoon I'm in here, one afternoon I'm somebody's best friend. Those are all selves, aspects of self that I have to know those aspects, because what surprises me and what derails me emotionally and in terms of emotional sobriety is when some damn self shows up and I'm like, who asked you? And that's really how I need to learn, is like, be prepared for all those selves to show at any given moment, and know that all of them are well fed, well cared for, and have had a recent nap, so it doesn't just throw the whole train off the track. That's all I got right there.
I love it. That's so good. It's like, who invited you to this party, right? Oh, that's so good. That's right on.
Well, I can see why you'd have an inner Tasmanian devil.
I like her. I like that Tasmanian devil in her, isn't it?
Yeah,
Right?
yep. The idea of this Mr. Hyde, right? It speaks to me in modern terms of the idea that I'll quote Ernie again. I must thirst. So where will I direct that thirst? And either I'm going to direct it to some productive and useful things that are good for my community and good for my soul, and I'll write a song, or I'll blog, or I'll start a Zoom meeting, or my thirst is going to direct itself at things that are self-destructive, things that are manipulative, things that are sort of that constant addictive, more. How do you like it? How do you like it? Sorry, it's the area I came from. Gotta go.
You're still younger than I am, though. I don't really like it, but
What do you think about this, John?
well, I have a real problem with the whole idea of just what Marya actually brought up, this idea of a singular self, or I haven't experienced that a lot. I tried, and part of what I tried to do was find these principles that I was supposed to live by and that I was supposed to be, and just walk according to those, which is fine, except that that's a very intellectual process. And it wasn't real helpful for me in finding a way into my body. Um, I thought the whole point was to stay from here up, and the only reason I had a body was to carry my head around, and that and I hear people also talk about things like, well, the mind this and the body that. I don't find that useful. I find it much more useful to think of it as an entire integral being that doesn't end necessarily at my skin even.
Yeah.
And so I know that's not exactly on point with what this slide is about, but it's what I struggle with a lot of times in trying to communicate the sense of what I see as interpersonal neurobiology or spirituality, if you will. Problematic term for me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mind the term spirituality simply because it's broad enough. I once gotten a wonderful argument. I think John, you may have been there as well. Fight with Roger C. about the word spirit, lacking a better word. The idea of what we are besides the sum of our parts, that larger, like the composite self, is a useful concept for me as well, because the idea of a Mr. Hyde implies the idea of a Dr. Jekyll, which is that either or, that dichotomous, that sort of Descartes sort of, body mind split, blah, 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 blah. That said, that isn't useful to me, because that allows me to shunt off body, bad self, things I did wrong, past mistakes, into a little box where I'm like, those are the bad self. I don't acknowledge those anymore. That isn't helpful, because if you go right to the promises, we will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. If I'm not aware of Mr. Hyde and his needs and, dumbness and ragingness, he's going to keep informing my behavior as Dr. Jekyll, and I'll keep being really disintegrated. Just disintegrated as a person. It will not make me functional. It will not make me useful in my life.
And we all have a Hyde in us too.
Heidi, Heidi, ho.
Is that Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Joe? Is that a Blood, Sweat, and Tears reference?
Just trying to get the disco out of my head.
I love it. Well, look, I love what Ernie Larson says when he says, "Who's driving the bus?"
Mhm.
Who do you got in the driver's seat? And see, that's that. When we think about that definition about an appropriate balance and coordination of all that we are, well, it means that we need some part of us to do the coordination, to be driving that bus, that is going to be able to take more of an integrative position, right? And to be able to pull what is valuable from the different parts of ourselves.
But for me, that's what conscious awareness is all about.
Yeah, there you go. That's what conscious and awareness can do. It can be the integrating force, can it?
Because then it doesn't become, it doesn't have to be some singular part of me that's in charge.
Yeah.
It's really about, because what day is it? It depends on who's driving the bus. Well, it depends on where we're going and who shows up.
That question, I actually, the business of driving the bus, I do think, and who we put in charge, without creating, a great deal of dissociative crumminess for people who deal with that stuff. I have a very good friend who deals with schizoaffective disorder, and she's perhaps the sanest person I've ever met. She's like, if you need anything orderly done, she's the person to go to, because she's the only person I know who is consciously aware at all times of who, in fact, is driving the bus in her brain. And so I'll say, when you're dealing with psychosis, for example, like your brain has hijacked, things have gone totally awry. I'm like, what do you do? How do you note to yourself, this is happening? She's like, oh, you need a little insight. She says, but I put healthy Christy in charge of sick Christy, and healthy Christy puts sick Christy in the car, takes her home to bed. Most of us don't have a construct within which to have to do that. Most of us are allowed to kind of ramble around, letting self after self take over the bus. But of necessity, people who've dealt with things like, whether it's severe trauma, whether it's war memory, whether it's, schizoaffective disorder, whatever the thing is, when we have been forced to deal with disintegration, we are asked to and need to find a way to manage those selves in a way that's more productive and more healthy. And I feel like that's a lesson anyone who doesn't deal with dramatic psychic issues can learn from. I mean, I can learn from her and put my grown-up self in charge of my Tasmanian devil when needed. I find that to be a useful tool on a fairly regular basis.
No, right on. And listen, what we're talking about, when I talked about before, as soon as I adopt this idea of who I'm supposed to be, right, this false self, then any part of me that doesn't fit with that blueprint gets disowned, right? And so now, and those disowned parts don't go away, they just get projected on everybody else. So if it's not okay for me to be angry, I'm going to see a lot of anger in the world, right? If it's not okay for me to feel love, then I'm going to project all the love out into the world. So whatever we disown gets projected. And that's a very important part of this. And so once you start to integrate it, it's no longer projected. You're able to now have a relationship like you just described. The healthy self is able to take care of the part that's having a little trouble and take her home and put her to bed. All right, let's go on to the next one.
I've recently come to believe that this can be achieved. I believe so because I begin to see many benighted ones, folks like you and me, commencing to get results. Last autumn, depression, having no really rational cause at all, almost took me to the cleaners. I began to be scared that I was in for another long chronic spell. Considering the grief I've had with depressions, it wasn't a bright prospect.
So I'm going to do this a double slide.
I kept asking myself, why can't the 12 steps work to release depression? By the hour, I stared at the St. Francis prayer. It's better to comfort than to be comforted. Here was the formula, all right. But why didn't it work?
So we're going to put a bookmark there and we're going to do one more slide.
Suddenly, I realized what the matter was. My basic flaw had always been dependence, almost absolute dependence on people or circumstances to supply me with prestige, security, and the like. Failing to get these things according to my perfectionist dreams and specifications, I had fought for them. And when defeat came, so did my depression.
So this is Bill's insight. So now we're starting to see the results of the work he had done. So he realized his basic flaw, and he talks about his basic flaw, or our basic flaws, a lot, especially in the 12 and 12. He realized it had been dependence, and he called it almost absolute dependence on people or circumstances to supply him with prestige, security, and the like. So where did Bill put his emotional center of gravity? Well, he realized he put it in people. He put it in people to give him the support that he couldn't give himself. So that's what our emotional dependency does, is the things I am unable to do for myself, I'm going to expect you to do them for me. And that's what he's talking about here. So he depended on people for his self-esteem, for his prestige, for his security, and the like. Then he goes on to say, failing to get these things according to my perfectionist dreams and specifications. Our emotional dependency generates a bunch of rules, demands, claims that we make on life, on people, on circumstances. We expect things to go the way that we want them to go. And Bill's style to get them to happen was to, move against people. There's three styles. You move against, you move towards, or you move away from people. Those were Dr. Karen Horney's insights. So when you move against people, you try to control them, or you rebel against them. But in Bill's case, he tried to control them. Hey, you should do it this way. He tried to, whatever tactics he had to control. If people can't do it rationally, then if people, are bullies, then they'll try to get you to do it their way by threatening you. Some people move towards people. They try to be people pleasing, and they manipulate people from that particular point of view, or they move away from people, trying not to need anything at all so that they don't have to have any feelings and any reaction. When Bill tried to control others and he couldn't pull it off, he got deflated and he got depressed. That's what he realized, is that he was trying to manipulate people, trying to get people to do things his way. And when they didn't cooperate, he didn't know how to cope. And all he could do was to feel bad. And I think a lot of us can relate to that. I know I can.
I mean, here's a question for you, Alan. Do you think Bill would be diagnosed today as bipolar or depressive?
I don't use any of those things. I don't even think of it. I see that all of that diagnostic stuff is just too categorizing people. I don't think of people that way. Mm-hmm. I think Bill was struggling to find some way to be okay in this world. And this is how he was reacting and how he was wired to it. So I don't think in terms of diagnosing in that kind of way. I think of more what I like to think of as what's the working point for someone. Mm-hmm. What is missing in a person's personality that if they had that they could function in a better way, that they could be healthier. So that's what I'm more concerned about than diagnosing them. Somebody raised a question earlier, well, wasn't Bill just a narcissist? And aren't we just talking about narcissists here? Well, I think that the reality is, and this is development, we all go through a narcissistic stage. There's narcissism in every person out there. It doesn't mean you have a narcissistic personality disorder. So let's not confuse that if you're narcissistic, that it's up to a narcissistic personality disorder, right? Which is a whole different ballgame. But every one of us is concerned with self. We're self-centered, right? We want things to be our way. We just do it in very different ways. We manipulate the world from either our top dog or our underdog. And it's the same thing. It's not that it's that different, because we're still trying to get things to be the way we think they need to be for us to be okay.
Yeah, he's speaking from a top dog
yes,
point
he
of view,
is.
but I came in here with no sense of self. I needed your approval, and I was willing to do anything to get it. Eventually I got to the point where I like approval, but I have my own value system now. I know
That's-
what I stand for, and I'm not willing to do anything to get it. But that took me to some pretty dark places, trying to be all things to all people.
Yeah. And see, that would be the moving towards people's solution, right? Where we erase ourselves and say, I'll be whatever you want me to be, just love me.
Mhm.
Right? It's that kind of thing. Well, the other person that takes the appeal of mastery, he doesn't take that. It says, look, I'm going to do all these great things. Love me. I've got the answers. I'm a know-it-all. I know how to do this. I win all the time. Love me for that. That's that other direction. But it's still that attempt to try to manipulate. And look, let's take all of this out of that too, because we all have a part of us that wants to master things. That's healthy. What did Bill call it? Instincts gone awry. Any of these things, they're not pathological. The desire to master things, to figure things out, to be able to feel good about something, that's a wonderful thing. The idea to be coordinated and have someone love you and to be in relationship with someone, that's wonderful. The idea of letting certain things go and not making things important, that the appeal of freedom, that's healthy too. But when we use one of those to cope, and that's our go-to mechanism, that's where the trouble comes in, because then our behavior is fixed, right? We say a broken clock has the right time twice a day, but only twice a day. And that's what these solutions are. They're fixed. They work some of the times, but not all the time. And what we want to do is try to find a way to show up in the world where we've got a lot more possibilities. We've got the flexibility, the fluidity. What we say is to have a solid and yet flexible sense of yourself.
Now, I want to jump off. I'm sorry, Joe, go ahead.
No, you go.
Oh, okay. I just want to address a little bit of a flurry of questions regarding the idea of depression and maybe what Bill means or meant, who knows, by depression, and the distinction that may or may not exist between that and what we now call clinical depression or manic depression or bipolar. Diagnoses aside, because diagnoses themselves are not fixed or verifiable even externally, the aspect that I think is useful about the 12 steps when dealing with a diagnostic or likely diagnostic concern. For example, I've been diagnosed with bipolar for 1 billion in 2 years. That the 12 steps don't cure that. The 12 steps do, however, give me a means, and this goes back to a conversation happening earlier in the Q&A, they give me a means of emotional regulation, or they contribute to my understanding of emotional regulation that helps me distinguish between this is a biologically driven mood swing, and this is me having a temper tantrum because I'm in the middle of a breakup. Those are, in fact, discrete items. And in fact, it's very, very easy, whether biologically driven or not, it's very easy for me to confuse that which I just don't like in my emotions, uncomfortable emotions, which I'm likely to medicate with any number of strategies, and what is a clinical concern with which I need assistance from a professional who knows how to manage that stuff better at this point than I do. Over time, depression, mania, the far edges of those mood swings have become a much less serious matter in my day-to-day life because I'm able to emotionally regulate better than I was when I came into the program 20 years ago. It's much easier for me now to say, I don't think I need to get manic over this. That doesn't mean when mania comes, it isn't real. It means that I don't need to jump on the roller coaster unnecessarily. It means when I'm hijacked, but I know how to get back.
Yeah, that's great.
Steps are by no means a cure. They are not a fix. They're not saying that depression and biologically driven mental health issues aren't real. They give me a tool in my toolkit, like meditation, like exercise, like therapy. Those are all tools. All of them are fundamentally helpful to me in the process of recovery on all fronts.
The other thing that I wanted to mention about this, I think, Alan, you mentioned the idea of sort of the idea of instincts on a rampage. I hear people talk all the time about defects of character, and one of the reasons I have a problem with that phrase is because it makes it sound like an object that can get removed. And one of the things that Bill wrote in step 6 was that the measure of our defects is the extent to which our instincts drive us blindly, or we demand more than is possible or due us. And for me, that's the distinction. It's a continuum. It's not a black or white thing. And the extent to which I let my instincts drive me is what has driven me right into the toilet very often. And so to me, that's important, to think of it not in terms of an object that has to get removed, but as behaviors related to an instinctual drive, and how far I'm willing to go to try and demand that get met.
Yeah, I like that. So let's go back to the bookmark that I said about it's better to comfort than to be comforted, right? That phrase from the St. Francis prayer. Well, I hope you're starting to hear that might have a different meaning to it. Because we're told that all the time. If you're in a bad place, go ahead and, be of service to someone else. Go ahead and comfort someone else that's in trouble, which is a great idea. I'm not saying that that's not helpful at times. It can be very helpful. But it's also helpful. It's better to comfort than to be comforted, to think about how can I learn to comfort myself instead of going out and trying to get someone else to comfort me when I'm not in a good place, especially someone that might be mad at me. It's such a crazy thing. And I see it all the time when I work with couples. Somebody's in a situation and one partner's really upset and the other partner's turned into that person for support at that point, and it's not available. Now, I'm not saying don't turn to your partner for what you need. Do that. But when it's not available, we have to appreciate what is available. And if what's not, and if what is available, that they're just honest and say, I'm not able to comfort you right now, then I appreciate their honesty. Instead of making me wrong for trying to ask them for comfort, then my job is to figure out how to comfort myself. How do I have to deal with the part of me that's upset, that didn't get what I wanted, or whatever the situation is, and to try to restore my balance? That becomes an important part of emotional sobriety. All right, let's go to the next slide so we don't run out of time here.
Well, and I came out of a religious
There
tradition
was
that said it wasn't okay.
making the ongoing love of St. Francis a workable and joyous way of life until these fatal and almost absolute dependencies were cut away. Because I had over the years undergone a little spiritual development, the absolute quality of these frightful dependencies had never before been so starkly revealed. Reinforced by what grace I could secure in prayer, I found I had to exert every ounce of will and action to cut off these faulty emotional dependencies upon people, upon AA, indeed upon any act or circumstance whatsoever. Then could I be free to love as Francis did. Emotional and instinctual satisfactions I saw were really the extra dividends of having love, offering love, and expressing love appropriate to each relation of life.
So I remember when I came in the program and I was told, what you're going to do here in Alcoholics Anonymous, you're going to replace one unhealthy dependence for a much healthier dependence on AA. And there was something that was wrong about that, and I didn't know what it was. Because some of the struggles I had in AA were some of the similar struggles I had in my life, and it didn't seem like that was a much better alternative. And then I realized, when I started to understand what Bill was talking about, is that really the program is to grow us to be able to stand on our own 2 feet. That doesn't mean I don't need other people, because I do, but it's my responsibility to be in relationship with them in a way that will go ahead and help me develop myself and help me become the person I want to be. But if I depend on AA to do that, it's going to be the same problem. I'm just taking the dirty shoe off the one foot and put it on the other. Now, Bill, you can imagine the struggle he had. Here he's walking into meetings. He's the co-founder of this incredible program. So, of course, he's going to have all these accolades and people just, very, very grateful for what he's done. And he realized what a slippery slope that was for himself. So then he says, when we start to, and I disagree that you can fatally, take these things and cut out our fatal dependency. It's, I agree with what John said before. I think we can have a different relationship with these dependencies and not let them run our life in the way they were. But as we start to do that, there is a certain freedom that's created. We become free to love. He says to have love, offer love, and express love appropriate to each relation of life. Now that's a whole new concept. As I started to mature, I realized I didn't have to feel towards each and every person that came in my life the same way. That there's some people I was going to have a better connection with, that I enjoyed more than other people, and that I have preferences, and that's okay. I'm not wrong. I don't have to love everyone. I don't have to feel good about it. I don't have to be friends with everyone. I can respect everyone because that's who I choose to be in my life. But I can differentiate. And so that's the word you're going to hear me start using when I describe emotional sobriety. We raise our differentiation, our ability to separate ourselves from these concepts and these ideas of who we should be and start to discover what's important to us.
I want to speak to the aspect of this that's having love, offering love, and expressing love appropriate to each relation of life. That's so important to me because, and perhaps there's a gender element of this, perhaps not. I'm not totally sure of this. It's a fact that I have experienced people expecting me to provide a great deal of love. And I have experienced myself telling myself, I don't need other people's love. I don't need other people's respect. I don't need other people to give me space or time. So to me, a lot of emotional sobriety, when it comes to relationships, for example, love or agape, any type of love, any type of relationing, a lot of it for me is recognizing what is an appropriate amount of self to give over. Because my feeling about emotional sobriety is that when I am lacking a sense of self, I wind up in Bill's shoes where I am putting that, I am putting all of the burden of who am I on a relationship, a job, a title, an education, a money, a thing. When myself is bound up in an external factor, an external item, person, anything, that self does not actually exist within me. When that person, that job, that title, that thing disappears, where do I go? So there has to be some sort of sense that I am present, I am safe, I am secure in myself, I exist, even if you disappear. That's called, like to me, that's important in moving out of the mirror phase of infancy. Little infants, looking at their mothers will smile if their mother is smiling, cry if their mother is crying. At 46, I should hope to hell that if you are crying, I can sit still and be okay. That said, offering love, being able to give love, being able to be present for people remains a value that I'm still developing. And for me, there is always the question of boundaries. How much do I give? How much do I allow of myself to be in someone else's life? And to me, that's more opposing of a question than anything else. I'm really just throwing it out there. Like it is better to love than to be loved. Possibly true in an ethical sense. However, I also need to not totally self-abnegate, or I disappear and am no longer useful to others, am no longer able to love others. If there is no self or sense of self that is loved and is real, even if you all disappear.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Ditto there. There was a comment about self-will run riot has been demonized. But that doesn't mean self-will isn't a useful tool for recovery and emotional sobriety any more than your best thinking got you here. No, my impulsive thinking. My best thinking actually did get me to the AA meeting, right?
That's it.
I hear that.
That's so true, man. That it gets so undifferentiated, doesn't it?
Yeah, that sort of black and white thinking, right? And
Yep.
and love is such a emotionally charged thing, right? And self-love, and what you said, Alan, about being our own advocate for our own self-care, our own self-love, our own self-healing. That is a little bit of self-will, a little bit of right-sizing, a little bit of everything we've sort of talked about here.
Right.
But being dependent on others, that's going to be a problem.
And
Right.
that emotional dependency upon AA really strikes for me, because it reminds me of the emotional dependency that I placed on all the different spiritual processes that I went through, thinking that they were going to solve my my quote unquote problem, and depending on that. It's like a lot of times when I hear people say turn it over, what I hear is I don't want to deal. you know and we don't get to absolve ourselves of responsibility for ourselves. And so I really like that it included dependencies upon AA, because it puts me in the picture, because that's kind of where I went with things.
No, I thought that was most helpful when he included that. Most helpful. All right. So we got a few more slides, and then we'll talk a little bit about step 10 before we bring this webinar to a close.
Plainly, I could not avail myself to God's love until I was able to offer it back to him by loving others as he would have me. And I couldn't possibly do that so long as I was victimized by false dependencies. For my dependencies meant demand, a demand for the possession and control of the people and the conditions surrounding me. While those words, absolute dependence, may look like a gimmick, they were the ones that helped to trigger my release into my present degree of stability and quietness of mind, qualities which I am now trying to consolidate by offering love to others, regardless of the return to me. This seems to be the primary healing circuit, an outgoing love of God's creation and his people, by means of which we avail ourselves of his love for us. It's most clear that the real current can't flow until our paralyzing dependencies are broken, and broken at depth. Only then can we possibly have a glimmer of what adult love really is.
Mm.
If we examine every disturbance we have, great or small, we will find at the root of it some unhealthy dependence and its consequent demand. Let us, with God's help, continually surrender these hobbling demands. Then we can be set free to live and love. We may then be able to gain emotional sobriety.
So Bill started out by talking about what the problem was, and now he gives us some idea in terms of a solution. And we know from the structure of the steps that he liked inventories, right? And taking a look at things. So he says if we examine every disturbance we have, whether it's a big deal or not, if we're upset, it's worth looking into. And I think that we need to hear that, because these expectations we have are all over the place. I mean, they're like these invisible rules that we're constantly running into in our life. He goes, we're going to find at the root of that upset, right, our disturbance, an unhealthy dependence and its consequent demand. So once again, we go back to the formula. Our dependency generates these claims, these demands, these unenforceable rules. And instead of us looking at surrendering those, before what we did is try to demand others to cooperate with our nonsense, right? We tried to manipulate. And it wasn't an easy thing for me to swallow that idea that I was a manipulator, but boy, I was a good manipulator. And I'll tell you, if you're in a relationship with a psychologist, my God, I'm really good at manipulation. I'm cleaning that up a lot in my life today, but boy, early on, I was masterful at it. He goes, we can surrender these demands. See, and so when I start to surrender these demands that things have to be my way, I can then, as I said in the beginning of this, instead of objecting to life happening, I can get on with coping with what's happening. And if I don't know how to cope, this is where now I create an opportunity for myself to develop a capacity that I don't have, that it hasn't been available to me. I say this all the time, and I'm going to be giving away a secret. But if none of my patients are listening, none of you can tell anybody that I said this. See, I don't really listen to my patients. I'm going to say that again. I don't listen to my patients. I'm almost embarrassed to say it. I listen to what they're not saying. See, it's what we aren't able to say tells us what's missing in our life. What I can't say when I run into a problem, what I can't do to deal with it, tells me about what I need to develop in myself. See, this shows me where the holes, and I say that HOLES, where the holes are in my functioning. And what before, when I said trouble doesn't mean something's wrong, it means that I am now stepping into one of those holes. I'm on one of those slippery spots in my life where I don't know what to do. I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know how to keep my balance. I don't know how to hold on to myself. That's another phrase I use a lot with emotional sobriety, holding on to ourselves. When I surrender these demands, now I create the possibility of learning how to cope and how to deal with life. So that's all I want to say on that. And let me open that up to the rest of the panelists.
There is a question that I knew would come up about surrendering and hobbling yourself and getting God's help and that kind of stuff. How does that translate for those of us who are agnostic, atheist, or free thinkers? Maybe Joe or Marya would like to talk about that.
I'm sorry, go, Joe, you go. This is you.
Okay. I mean, just personally, and I'm not, I think there are very intelligent people who have a, sort of a theistic worldview. And I don't think it has to do with being like the idea of prayer answering sobriety, granting God. I don't think it's necessarily an underdeveloped idea, but I sort of gave that up with a lot of my other magical thinking of youth. But what replaced it, right? It's sort of a humanist sort of thing, that my role in the world, the people in my life, the group of drunks, so to speak, or these were the sort of things that I can forgive that, because he's not telling me, I hear it as him talking from his own experience and his own explanation, his own A plus B equals C, and then a miracle happened. And, I've got a different B, and that's fine that he doesn't. I don't dismiss him completely because of that. But I have to find what's right for me as opposed to just objecting. I can be a conscientious objector, but now what am I going to do? Thanks.
I'm going to right off of that and to go up to the question of, just to be an English teacher for a teeny second, when one surrenders something, one does not necessarily have an object for that surrender. A surrender is an independent verb. One can just surrender the thing. And so for me, what's useful about the idea of surrendering stuff is simply the let go of it, like put the damn thing down. If what I'm hanging on to is, again, I'll switch over to the Buddhist point of view, clinging is still clinging, hanging on to anything. I don't have to give it to God to let go of it. I can just loose my hand. It isn't, without a theistic worldview, it's as easy to drop it as it is to turn it over. Turn it over to the ground, to the garbage can, it doesn't really matter. If theistic worldview is yours, great, that works very, very nicely. If it's not, though, you can still put it down. It doesn't matter where it goes. It just doesn't need to be mine. I don't need to be carrying that around any further.
Yeah, great comments.
I'm really glad I asked you two to answer that.
Here's another interesting way to think about this. See, what I think happens here is we have this organismic wisdom that I made reference to earlier about that you don't have to tell a child, okay, go ahead, it's time to walk, right? You don't have to do that. A child wants to do that. Why does a child want to do that? Because there's this force inside of them that moves them towards being what they can be. So when I surrender something that I think that I needed to be, that I needed to have a certain way, and I let go of it, as we just talked about, then I throw myself into an existential crisis. I'm not trying to manipulate the other person anymore. I'm letting that go, but I have no idea what the hell to do. See, in that place, in that space, it's the same space we hit when I say I am powerless and I suffer from this disease. I don't really know what the hell that means in terms of I don't have recovery yet. I'm just admitting that I'm powerless. I create an existential crisis. This existential crisis is so important because if you sit in it and you don't try to resolve it too quick, you let it move you, you will move yourself towards what you need to start growing yourself. You'll start to automatically cry. You'll start to ask questions. That organismic wisdom that we have that moves you towards being what you can be will take over. You don't have to manipulate anymore. That's the miracle I see, Joe, when I see people doing that, is that there's something in them that starts moving them in a certain way. That's the part that was opened up when I came to the program. That's the part that I was able to recover, is in one way is to restore my humanity, because that's a part of our humanity, is to move us towards what we can be. So that's the way I think about it. It's very interesting. I went to Vietnam as part of a four-man delegation back in 2011. And I had to submit all my slides to the Communist Party because they had to censor things before I could talk, right? It was a very interesting experience. So I wanted to give a talk on the therapeutic value of the 12 steps, right? And of course, I submit the steps as they're written. And what is the word that's in the steps that the Communist Party is not going to accept? God. There's no God. The Communist Party is God. And then I tried to edit it, and I sent them things that, well, how about higher power? I say, no, you can't use higher power because there's only one higher power. That's the Communist Party. So I was left with higher self. They could buy that. That wasn't equivalent with them. Very interesting experience. Very interesting experience.
Higher purpose.
And it worked for me because that's really what I thought. Yeah, higher purpose, anything like that, it works. I think we can all say that we're all talking about something very similar. Let's go on to the next slide, and then we'll jump in. We're hit 3 o'clock, but we'll just take a few more minutes.
Of course, I haven't offered you a really new idea, only a gimmick that has started to unhook several of my own hexes at depth. Nowadays, my brain no longer races compulsively in either elation, grandiosity, or depression. I've been given a quiet place in bright sunshine.
So I love that idea of unhooking, because that's what we're doing, is we're unhooking people from our demands. And look at step 10 is a wonderful step towards being able to self-regulate. We continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, we promptly admit it. So what are we looking at here? Well, Bill says it's a spiritual axiom that every time we are disturbed, no matter cause, there is something wrong with us. And today we've talked about a way that you can use that program of looking at what's upset you, being able to understand what is the unhealthy demand that's underneath it, and the expectations that generates. On my website is a form that I developed and that I made some kind of changes to. It's in my book, 12 Smart Things, but you can download it for free. I have a lot of open sources on my website, and it's there, and you can use it to unpack some of your disturbances and to get at what's going on. He also said, when he was talking about step 10, that we can stop making unreasonable demands upon those we love. And that's what we're looking for, right? Is to try to be coordinated in a much healthier way. And then he says the spot check inventory taken in the midst of such a disturbance can be a very great help in quieting stormy emotion. So with that, let me go to the last slide, and then you want to take a few more minutes for questions, John?
That's fine if panelists can stay, or if
I can stay for a few minutes, but let me just say this is what Bill said in a summary of something that I think is so fitting for emotional sobriety, that sobriety is only the bare beginning, because that's what we've been talking about today. It is only the first gift of the first and awakening. And if more gifts are to be received, our awakening has to go on. And if it does go on, that we find that bit by bit by bit, we could discard the old life, the one that didn't work, for a new life that can and does work under any conditions, whatever, regardless of worldly success or failure, regardless of pain or joy, regardless of sickness or health, or even of death itself. A new life of endless possibilities can be lived if we are willing to continue our awakening. So that's the promise that this holds for us. I'll just put up a slide if people want to go to my website, that you can download that form, and there's other freebies. There's some other talks that are posted on there if you'd like. And I can only stay a few more minutes, John. I do have a commitment to my family that I want to honor here, but I'll hang out for a few seconds.
Well, thank you. Joe or Marya, would you like to make any closing statements or anything? Or are there questions that you found that you think need to be addressed?
The one thing that I would add is that there was a brief exchange with one of the Q&A people where I said that I felt, for me, meditation, and whether one calls that like a practice of meditation or spiritual practice or a mindfulness practice, that has been absolutely indispensable in the process of attaining or even understanding a concept like emotional sobriety. Meditation is the only way I've ever encountered, and I have those, the great big bad diagnostic reasons why I can't be healthy, and reasons why I can't be sober, and reasons why I can't stay alive. That's all fine and good, but I'm fine. And meditation actually is what has been most helpful to me, in addition to other pieces. Therapy, exercise, sobriety, physical sobriety has been indispensable for me in staying on the beam, but also in deepening a life that is, as someone said in a meeting the other day, a life from which I do not wish to escape. I've no longer felt it necessary to get out of the life I'm in. I don't like it every day. I don't even like myself every day, but here I am. These are my only options. This is the box I came in. And so I get to deal with it. And this is also the world I'm in. And so for me, meditation is a practice that isn't separable from emotional sobriety. That's my last bit. If anybody wants to chat about that further, I'm happy to another time. Thank you for being here, everybody. This has been a joy.
Thank you, Marya.
Everybody. Yeah, I wish it could have been more interactive, because I mean, we do have a fairly sophisticated audience, but maybe we can get 4 different people up here next time we do this.
Well, what we can do, Joe, I mean, the other thing is that we could open up a discussion sometime where we leave more room for discussion for people.
Yeah.
And create another format, maybe part 2 to this talk today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the things I'm hoping is that, for my concluding remarks, is we do have a feedback page. It should have been posted in the chat. We really are serious about getting feedback. I'm going to try and filter through the Q&A because I'll have a copy of it that I can download, and see if our panelists, if there's a particular one that might be good for them, maybe they'd be willing to respond on our blog on the Freethinkers Living Sober.
Sure.
We have a special website just for emotional sobriety, and that's also been posted in the chat. And I can't fail to take this opportunity to say thank you so much to everyone who showed up. I told you I'm a crier. To everyone who showed up, and Alan and Joe and Marya, it's been great. Thank you.
And John and Mark and Kat.
And absolutely, without John and Mark and Kat, we wouldn't have been able to do it. Thank you so much. Anything else that anybody wants to say before I say that I want to just.
No, John, I just want to thank you and all that work that you and Joe have put into making this happen, everybody that support us, and to all of those that you are listening today. Please share this. I have started an emotional sobriety anonymous meeting on Thursday nights, and John said he's going to post that on the website so you can get the Zoom information on that. Come and join us. It's just we get together and we talk about emotional sobriety. I've got some other seminars coming up. I'm doing something next weekend for the South Bay Roundup here in Southern California. So stay the course. There's a lot of good stuff coming out up down the pike here, and it's an exciting time to be in recovery.
And we will be posting the audio version of this. I'm not sure about the video version, but the audio version, when I can finally get to it, will get posted on the es.freethinkerslivingsober.org pages. So you can look for that. And I will be posting links to our panelists' books and all of that kind of stuff.
Fantastic.
Well,
okay. Have a great day, everyone.
Everyone, thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate it.